Okay, so the next part, we're going to discuss whether attentional amplification is always necessary for consciousness. And this part of the topic is one of the most controversial topics in the current consciousness research. My sort of the standpoint is that it is not always necessary for consciousness, but other researchers say different things. And I'll just declare that my the point is like that, and also the questions and the quiz for this week is based on the factual sort of the knowledge about the lecture contents, not the opinions or the sort of the belief about these things. Okay. So here's the first sort of the recap of what I discussed a couple of last week. So according to the global neural network space theory, stimulus has to be sufficiently strong to activate these posterior or occipital brain areas for the visual areas. Otherwise, this neuronal activation is too weak to propagate. And then also top-down attention has to amplify these signals to make it pass to the prefrontal areas or parietal areas and so on, to eventually achieve this conscious reportability. Otherwise, it is confined within these occipital temporal areas and then do not get reported. Okay, no reportability. Reportable is quite difficult things to do. We just cannot report, okay? Even though if it can be experienced. The question is, what is an ideal method to study possibility of necessity of attentional amplification for conscious perception? So in week 8, I discussed, I suggested a couple of methodology. So in week 8, I overviewed a couple of methodologies, including inattentional and change blindness, as well as attentional blink. And then these experiments tend to be interpreted as a necessity of attention. So unless you attend to, you do not even see a gorilla that goes across the display. And another one is that even if there is a change, unless you attend to, you do not perceive the big change that you cannot help seeing after once you notice it. Okay. However, in these experiments or experimental paradigm, it's not that easy to interpret these experimental result as a pure necessity of attentional amplification, because as I explained in this bias competition model or of the neuronal circuit, attention is always on one side it is a selection and the amplification of one thing, and the another one is the inhibition of unwanted stimulus. So both in attentional and the change blindness situation, you might argue that we do not experience like gorilla or small changes in the change blindness because we actively suppress it through attentional inhibition. And if that's the case, then the argument about necessity of attentional amplification is not that easy to establish. So that's one of the problem. And then the other issue is that in both in attentional and change blindness, stimulus manipulation is also limited. It's a very interesting paradigm, but for example, to make the gorilla invisible, you need to have a setup where the transparent, people are passing the basketball, and then people are paying attention to the white team and then suppressing a black gorilla kind of thing. And it's not that easy to change all these things into many different kinds of color or spatial arrangement or dynamics and so on. And also change blindness wise, it's very interesting to generate the surprising kind of stimulus sets, such as the background of the face in the $20 bills changes from blackish to whitish kind of color. But it's not that easy to make any kind of a stimulus set in a systematic manner. And most likely, the contextual effect or expectation or expertise also make a difference for these things. So as an upshot, it is not that easy to manipulate attention and also conscious experience in an orthogonal manner in these things. Having said that, I'm not saying that it's not impossible. It's one of the active areas of the research, and it would be nice, honors project type questions, in fact. So instead of this inattentional blindness or change blindness, this week I'm going to focus more on what we learned from the dual tasks. And dual task is also something that I described in the week 8, but this week it's going to be in a more detailed manner. So just to recap, in a dual task situation, we present some stimulus. First, it starts with a fixation, and then ask people to perform very demanding tasks such as letter task here. So we tend to present the stimulus like 5 stimulus, rotated T's or L's, and then ask them either all L's or all T's, or one audible included. So in this case, one L is included among T's. So you need to press a button for the different, not the same. Okay, and then the difficulty of this central task is individually calibrated, which is very important, by masking the stimulus with a rotated Fs. And the rotated Fs have a common feature as Ls and Ts, so it's very effective in terms of the masking stimulus. And in the previous study, it has been established that doing this task at the center, letter task, exhausts almost all the attention. What it means is that if you have another task that seems to require attention, you just can't do both at the same time. And therefore, using this in the logic, people have tried to present some other stimulus, in this case, picture of the natural scene masked by natural scene mask, and then ask people to do a task on that. And then idea is that if the peripheral task requires substantial attention, then trying to do that peripheral task degrades the task performance of the center. And then you cannot do that simultaneously, both central and peripheral tasks. And that's the logic of this dual task. Okay. And as a upshot of this dual task paradigm is the following diagram. So x-axis is usually the performance of the primary task. Here, let's say it's an LT task, with a L, all the L's, or one T, included kind of thing. So this is a different situation, and this is the same situation, all L's or one T included here. And then it goes from 0.5 chance performance to something like 0.7 or 0.8, depending on the study, some kind of threshold, very difficult level of the task difficulty. And then that's controlled by the duration of the stimulus, or SOA, stimulus onset asynchrony. And then you do the same thing for the secondary task, okay? So the secondary task is also going from 0.5 to, let's say, 0.7 or 0.8, accuracy. It's very difficult. You set the mask performance, mask duration to be as difficult as the primary task as well, okay? So this is a typical mistake that many people make. So both primary and the secondary task has to be equally difficult, or equal performance on its own. So the task performance result cannot be explained by the difficulty of the task itself. Okay, this is something that I'm going to ask in the quiz. However, what we are interested in this dual task situation is that the trade-off of the task performance between the two tasks. If this primary task and the secondary task is drawing the same kind of resource, competing for neuronal resource or whatever, then trying to keep the performance of the secondary task will degrade the primary task performance. So that when you plot both secondary and primary and secondary task performance together, then it locates here. And then if you prioritize the primary task, it locates here. And then this diagonal line corresponds to the perfect trade-off between the two situations. On the other hand, if there is no trade-off, then each of the tasks can be performed perfectly on its own, but perfect in the sense of 0.7% accuracy or 70% accuracy, and also 70% accuracy, because both of them are made difficult on its own. But it doesn't interfere or interact in either way. And that corresponds to this top right location of this dual task performance. Here, X coordinate indicates a performance of the primary task, and the Y coordinate implies the performance of the secondary task. Okay, and both of them are not different from the single task performance of this guy and this guy. And then, as I said, if there is a complete trade-off, there can depending on the task instruction, like if you are asked to prioritize a primary task a lot, then it should locate somewhere towards bottom right. And then if you are asked to prioritize secondary task, it should locate somewhere here. But the important thing is that this diagonal line connecting the two single task performance should predict the two task performance. Okay. And then finally, there is also a possible situation where the task performance of the two draws a partially attention requirement, and that corresponds to anywhere in between the top right and the diagonal. That's an intermediate situation. Okay, so these are, roughly speaking, 3 different outcomes of the dual task situation. And before going into the result, I just want to discuss these advantages of the dual task paradigm when you consider the consciousness and attention. A consciousness without attention situation, right? Or asking this, if it's possible or not. And the first is dual task can minimize a stimulus interaction between the fovea and the periphery. So it can study one stimulus property at a time. And this is quite unlike the change in blindness. So what I mean, you can present the foveal letter task at within the 1.5 degree or even smaller location, so that your central spatial attention is presumably sucked up to this location. And then you can present the peripheral stimulus far away from here. And then at the periphery, we can ask whether this peripheral stimulus requires also attention or not, but without having to consider this interaction of the stimulus location. When the stimulus is very close to each other, I mentioned in a couple of weeks ago in week 6 and so on, there is an effect called crowding, right? So if you are fixating at the center, and then if you are trying to look at, let's say, orientation of these 3 things, the central thing becomes very difficult to see if it's surrounded by some other things. However, if it's on its own, it's easy to see. And this phenomenon crowding is also known to interact with attention. But what we are interested in the pure sort of the effect of attentional amplification. Is it necessary for consciousness? So we wanted, at some case at least, we want to minimize this kind of crowding-like effects, and then just purely look at attentional requirement or trade-off between the 2 tasks. And dual task can do it, but change blindness is not possible to do it, because change blindness does require some kind of complicated stimulus manipulation to achieve this distraction or misdirection of the expectation. Okay, so that's one advantage of the dual task. And then the second advantage of the dual task is this we can separate the effects of expectation, or memory, or attention from separate expectation and memory from the effect of the attention on consciousness. And this is very difficult to do with inattentional blindness or changing blindness again. If you remember, inattentional blindness, you are expecting you're focusing on the task of this counting the basketball, right, of the white team. And you're not expecting the gorilla to walk in. And if you're expecting it, you can actually see it. And this expectation and attention seems very similar, but there isn't also ongoing research showing that the expectation and attention is probably very different in terms of neural activity. Our own result seems to suggest that our expectation operates much, much earlier in terms of sort of, in terms of metaphor, you are going to open or close the door to the entrance of your house. That's the sort of expectation. If you expect things, you open it, but if you do not expect it, you close it. And then attention is more to do with how you treat this, guest that came inside of the house. Attention would be like, attentional enhancement is something like, after a guest is coming inside of the house, you treat them really well, and then, sort of amplify it inside the house. So this expectation and attention is likely to be different in terms of operation and also processing wise as well. But change blindness and inattention blindness is manipulating attention through the expectation. So it's very difficult to dissociate these things. And also memory is also tricky in attentional blindness or change blindness. Because here, what I mean is that when you say that inattentionally things are invisible, it's also plausible that because you do not pay attention, you forget quickly. But this is not the same as you don't attend to things and you do not experience it, right? So, for example, if I tell you like random numbers 4, 5, 7, 6, like 1, 7, 2, 10, 5, 2, 11, and things like that, then unless you have a really good memory, you do not remember everything. And as a subsequent report, you just can't report all these numbers. But that's not the same as you did not experience all these numbers. You just forget really quickly. Similarly, in attention blindness and change blindness literature, it's not clear still at this point whether people are experiencing things and then just quickly forgetting it. And forgetting speed could be different for different feature of the stimulus. So that's one possible viable explanation, but it's very difficult to also test with this. But now, with the dual task experiment, we can try to separate all these expectation and the memory from attentional effects. And we are going to discuss about these issues in the later weeks. Okay, so now the disadvantage of the dual task problem. So first of all, you might imagine also that doing the two things at the same time requires some kind of training. And in fact, it is the case. In the lab, if you try to ask people to do it, people can do it or not. There's a huge variability in terms of the individual difference, but that's usually because of the training or prior exposure to the dual tasking itself. But once people are trained, then this kind of dual tasking, multitasking kind of capability saturates really quickly, and then we can test this, attentional task requirement. However, to get to this stable level of the training, previous dual task paradigm has used something like sometimes 10 hours or 12 hours of the training, because even within 1 hour of the training, people do improve. It's called perceptual learning. And because of this, training related improvement, and because you want to measure the performance at both center only and peripheral only and the dual task, people have been very careful not to test a subject before the training finishes. But this comes across as a sort of the cost of doing this, detailed dual task paradigm. Of course, it takes time. It means that it is both human and also actual money-wise, it's costly. And also, more important and tricky thing about consciousness is that doing a lot of training makes a circuit of the brain potentially completely altered. And some of the things that you do really well, like riding a bicycle or writing letters and things like that, you do feel like you do it in a non-conscious manner. And in fact, all these practice very well trained task performance is known to work without conscious experience. And that's potentially because it is sort of the performed now in different parts of the brain, like in the cerebellum and so on. That is not to do with the consciousness. But anyway, the important disadvantage of the previous dual task paradigm is that lengthy training is necessary, but the lengthy training might make the performance non-conscious manner. And another important thing is that in the previous dual task paradigm was impossible to rule out the possibility that attention itself spills over to the stimulus during the dual task. So as the Bahadur-Bahrami's fMRI task proved, the low cognitive demand task, which does not require a lot of attention to the central task, seems to make it possible to spill over in terms of attention amplification of the peripheral task. So it is very difficult to rule out the possibility that when you find some evidence that we can perform the task under the dual task, you just can't say that we can consciously see that without any attention. It is still like requiring some kind of attentional amplification, but it's logically very difficult to argue whether it is yes or not. Okay. So my previous student, now currently postdoc in Japan, Riken, Julian Matthews, resolved some of these issues, at least to some extent. The first issue of the lengthy training is quite a bit shortened, and also ruling out the non-conscious processing is also achieved because of the shortened, lengthy training, as well as combining it with the measure of the metacognitive accuracy. Previously, all the dual tasks just measure the performance without any metacognitive accuracy. So it wasn't clear whether the people were doing it unconsciously or consciously, but now we have measure to do that. So here's the recap of the demonstration of our version of the task 2018. At the center, you see that there's a letter briefly flashed, and here it's all else and masked by F, and then followed by the response screen. Here comes 1T included and the masked by F. So that's a first response, same or different with a different level of confidence. Okay, it was the same and the confidence 3 and so on. And then at the same time, what you see is that in the periphery we present faces, and the faces is either male or female. Okay, so that was a female, and all throughout the task you are asked to fixate at the center. Okay, so you do not move your eyes, and then you still say that it was a male and so on. And then importantly, as you remember, that the speed of the masking for both central tasks, for the L or T's with the F, or mask for the face, you see the jumbled or scrambled texture pattern followed by each of the face is adjusted so that each individual subject can perform these tasks at 70% accuracy. And then the question is, what happens if you do both at the same time with minimum training. Okay, it's a bit complicated, but that's the sort of the experimental paradigm. And then this is the control experiment, or equally important experiment that we did. So here it is a peripheral task is now changed into the discrimination of the red to the right side on the green to the left side of that type of the disk, or green on the right and then red left type of the disk. Okay, and then you do the basically the same kind of experiment. And again, similar to the phase task, red green task is also equated in terms of 70% accuracy. Okay, so all of the three tasks, central, peripheral phase, and the peripheral red green task is always equally difficult at the 70% when you do the task on its own in a single task situation. Okay. And the first improvement that Julian achieved is to use the calibration procedure called the Quest, which is a detail that I'm not going to detail, can reduce the duration of the training quite a bit. So this pie chart shows that the previously shown this 2004 paper required like 10 to 12 hours or 6 to 12 hours of training before going into the main task, but now we shorten it into the 10, 15 minutes of the training. That's a substantial improvement, important not only for the, in terms of the cost, but also removing the possibility that, we are doing this task automatically, non-consciously in a zombie manner, okay? And this is first to show that, the original ready experiments, result. As I said, the dual task performance is usually presented in this format. So here, what you see is that the central performance is on the x-axis, starting from 50% as a sort of the chance performance, and then 100% is a perfect. And then, for example, this person DS performed a single task at the 75% or something like that, 78%. And then peripheral task performance, in this case, it's a face gender discrimination, is roughly 70%. So everybody has a baseline 70%, the single task performance for both central letter task and the peripheral face task, okay? And then each of them had lots of trial and lots of blocks, and then measure the mean location of the dual task. And here it's a mean location of the dual task performance for each individual subject, okay? And then usually dual task result is also presented in a way that, to make it easier to understand, x-axis and the y-axis is normalized to 100% being the same as a single task performance. And then here is the format, which is easier to understand. So normalized performance is being 100%, and normalized performance being for the periphery, 100%. These 6 subjects located pretty much at the top right, meaning that the face task, face gender discrimination task, and the letter discrimination task at the center does not interfere each other. And because the letter task consumes pretty much all the attention, you can conclude that, face gender discrimination task does not require attentional resource, even though it is equally difficult. And on the other hand, this the red-green disk task was completely at chance when they performed it in a dual task situation. So this means that red-green task does require attention to get the 70% performance. Again, I just say that the x-axis is always normalized, okay? Y-axis is normalized. So 100 corresponds to 70% and so on. And both tasks, face gender discrimination and disk tasks, are equally difficult at 70% when it's performed as a single task. However, as I mentioned, previous experiment could be explained by, okay, so face task is something that you do non-consciously, even though without attention, That's why you don't see the deficit. That's the possible, explanation, especially because of the 6 to 12 hours of training. However, when the Julian did the experiment with a very short training, just 15 minutes of the experiment, basically we replicated this result. For the faces, we see the trade-off to be almost like 0, right? Trade-off line is this diagonal. On the other hand, this disk task is almost diagonal. It's very it again replicated that disk or center task can be performed but not at the same time. So that's the first replication. And then the second component is that we added this confidence rating for each trial. And now with this, we can measure this metacognitive accuracy. And this is something that I explained in a week 4 or so. And then just to recap, in addition to the type 1 discrimination, where you present either face or non-face here, signal or noise, and then correctness of the decision itself, face or whether the task was whether the trial was correct or incorrect, and then assumption here is that the confidence rating should be high for correct trials and low for incorrect trials, if you know what you are doing. And that's a sort of one of the operational definition of the conscious access of the discrimination. And then in the case of the blind side people, I showed that blind side people can have a performance around here, meaning that it's a much above performance. But when you use this type of the type 2 task, making confidence rating after his own performance, then he tend to locate at this chance performance, metacognitive accuracy. So in the case of the blind side or continuous thrust suppression in a normal healthy subject, type 2 is always likely to be around the chance, but type 1 can be above chance. That's the point. And then we applied this technique for our face task. So here's the result. So before going into the type 2 analysis, first we want to show the confidence rating. This x-axis and y-axis is a confidence rating for the central task and the peripheral task. In the case of face, when subjects are correct, then their confidence rating is higher than incorrect. Okay, for both central task and also peripheral task. And then for both dual task as well, when the task was correct, then the confidence rating was high. But if it was incorrect, then the confidence rating was low. So there is an metacognitive access to whether you are correct or incorrect. But interestingly, this disk task situation, central task itself is same in terms of the confidence rating as expected here, and the peripheral task is also the same. When you are correct, they are higher in terms of confidence rating. But when they perform the 2 tasks at the same time, in terms of the central task, central correct or central incorrect can be differentiated by metacognitively. However, the peripheral red-green, whether it's correct or incorrect, it becomes completely impossible to discriminate whether it was correct or not by the confidence. And that results in this pattern of the type 2 performance, showing here that in the case of the face, it drops compared to the perfect situation, but it's definitely above chance metacognition. But in the case of the disk, it completely collapses. So because the performance itself is bad in the dual task situation, it's not a huge wonder, but we made sure that our subject cannot also metacognitively access to this information. And then this just briefly, this green and the blue dot. So this is to rule out the possibility of this inattentional amnesia. In all of these dual task situation, we ask 2 responses per trial. In this green dot, the task was to report either central letters or peripheral disk. And we did not ask 2 at the same time. And so it's really unlikely that people forget about the response, but still, we couldn't rescue the performance in any case. Okay, so from this, we can conclude that disk orientation is not something that is, inattentionally forgot, but it's more likely that it is inattentionally blinded. So finally, to rule out the spillover of the spatial attention, we did one of the experiment. It's not the perfect kind of control experiment, but I think still it's very interesting. We asked what happens if we merge face and the disk at the same time, like this way. Okay, we carefully calibrated the transparency of the disk and the face for each individual subject, and then achieve again the performance to be roughly 80% correct for both face task and also disk task, as well as central task. Okay, around 80. Triangle is always single task performance. However, in each trial or in each block, we asked either to report at the central letter and the face, which resulted in this excellent dual task performance, or central letter and disk, which is here. And this means that one particular object that is composed of the face and the color disk, some aspect gets lost by distracting the subjects by the central task, but some property remains, meaning that in this particular case, it's a face gender impression remains, whereas the disk color orientation relationship just becomes inaccessible if you do the attentional task. It's very difficult to imagine why this is the case, but if you become a subject of our experiment, you can experience by yourself. All the subjects reports that when you are doing a central task, you can still see the face gender, but you just can't see this color, subjectively speaking. And in terms of the metacognition, it's basically replicating the first experiment. So we can say that face discrimination is supported by the metacognitive axis. So it was a bit in detail, but it was important kind of experiment. To summarize, the dual task paradigm has revealed that some stimuli, namely face, gender, are consciously experienced with which is verified by the metacognitive accuracy without top-down attentional amplifications, without sort of qualification, but the same level of the top-down attentional amplification applied to the disk is definitely not possible to raise it into the conscious experience, but for some reason face gender you don't need that kind of amplification. But then the straightforward answer is that why do the effects of withdrawing top-down attention differ depending on the stimulus or task? That's the next question. And in fact, when we reviewed the literature of the dual task situation, the pattern of the results is not that straightforward. So the top row here is the ones the combination of the discrimination that does not require attention. But at that time of the review 2015, none of the this condition was measured with the metacognition. So we do not know 100% sure that whether they are consciously perceived or just non-consciously performed above chance. But anyway, the simple feature of the color or color orientation conjunction or orientation itself, or letters, if it's applied or not, if it's applied, T versus L, and then the natural scene, including animals or not, or face gender. These, you just can do it without attentional amplification. And then the pattern of the result is like, here. always, no dual task interference. And then these 5 things, red, green disk, or rotated letters, symbols in between, or the orientation of the rotation of the dots, or the lightening condition of the cube. All of these are the ones that require top-down attention. So these would fall into somewhere around here or here. This trade-off line. And you might have some kind of ideas of what makes it possible to perform without attention, and what makes it possible impossible. One possibility is that these faces and natural scenes and the upright T and Ls are in a sense complex but overlearned training stimuli, and maybe we have brain areas that are dedicated for each of them, and the local circuitry does not require any kind of attentional amplification. And these fundamental sort of the simplistic features are also like that. We also have a dedicated kind of circuit, and we don't need any attentional amplification. On the other hand, all these things in the bottom row may be something that is first of all, and it's an arbitrary combination of these features, right? It's an artificial kind of things, and so brain may need to bind these features artificially, attentionally to experience it, and that may be the reason first. And secondary, red-green case is in particular so, but maybe it is a local neuronal circuitry is interfering each other in some particular way, so that to resolve some kind of competition, like biased competition model, you need to have an attention to resolve these local circuit computation and to perceive it. But this is not known. It's a sort of frontiers of the consciousness research, and great for the honors project. Okay, so the question still remains, and one thing is that can we push the dual task paradigm further? And particular questions could be something like what about the other stimuli and tasks, such as different modality of the tasks. One of the students in our lab, Sharon Danielle, is asking whether we can find something like this in a tactile modality, and so far the answer seems to be no. And another possibility is the auditory stimuli, and so on. This is not asked before, partly because of the training of the dual task took really long time, but now we can make it much shorter. The second big question is that whether we can do this kind of task online. It still is very difficult to do, but if we can establish an online protocol of the dual task, then it's plausible to test many different kind of different combination of the stimuli and the tasks, and then see sort of we can map out what is the possible without attention, and what requires attention. We just need to know more about this taxonomy. And then, as I mentioned briefly, manipulation of the expectation and memory, separating it from attention, that's also possible, but not so many people have done so far. Our partial report paradigm with Julian is probably the first thing to be reported. And then also the mechanism of underlying these distinct psychological components are still unclear. Using EEG or fMRI to understand, what makes it possible to do the task, in parallel, and what makes it impossible without such attention amplification. It's unclear still at the level of the neurons. And then finally, can simple-minded activation equal consciousness model still maintainable or sustainable? That's the sort of theoretical kind of question. So this is one possible, model or sort of default kind of people's expectation about, conscious and non-conscious stimulus. Maybe there is some kind of threshold here, and conscious stimulus can be just attended or unattended, just can go over to this threshold, and then that's when you start to see the things, and that could be the case of the face gender discrimination. On the other hand, this unconscious stimulus could be that or artificial stimulus that has something like this red green thing. If you are not attending, then you just can't go over this threshold. But if you attend to it, it goes over the threshold. That's one kind of a default sort of the threshold or activation amount equal to consciousness kind of model. But I would say that this type of the model is just unsustainable and inconsistent with many for many reasons. Okay, and first of all, it just doesn't explain anything about why particular qualia, like visual qualia, coming out from visual cortex. All these activation and threshold type explanation, including the global workspace theories, explanation, should operate, everywhere, right? Like not only visual, but auditory cortex and olfactory, cortex and touch cortex and so on. Everywhere, it operates. But our experience generated by the visual cortex and the temporal cortex for sound is very different. Why is that? And secondly, that we even within the visual cortex, why do neurons in the fusiform area, when stimulated, elicits this face percept, like I showed in a couple of weeks ago, but the same kind of neurons close to each other in a B4, B8 area elicits color. That's really weird, and this activation consciousness model will never get to that kind of question. Now comes sort of the upshot of this, all these consciousness lectures actually for the last 3 weeks. What are the alternatives? First of all, some types of neural activation patterns must correspond to how we experience. It's not the simple activation amount. And then what kind of patterns? That's the next question. Many people have studied and proposed that it is a synchronous neuronal firing, like firing in auditory cortex and the frontal cortex simultaneously makes it possible for the auditory cortex generated sounds to reach to sort of the conscious frontal areas, something like that. Or the causal interactions. So neurons are connected to each other, and it forms a very complex network. And if the interaction achieves some types of the causal interactions, then that leads to a particular type of conscious experience. And the latter is something much closer to what I've been thinking about. And this is most clearly proposed by a particular theory called the integrated information theory of consciousness. And this is the theory that I'm going to explain next week and following week as well. And this is again forefront of the consciousness research, and it is also fairly controversial. Okay, that's it for this week. See you next week.